If we are old enough to think more than about 10 years or so, we may fondly recall the days when we carried a traditional checkbook with paper checks and a register. I recall when the coolest thing about a checkbook was that we could actually get duplicate checks, which meant when we wrote a check, it created a carbon copy underneath that we kept so that we always had a copy of the exact check. Now, as I say that, it also reminds me that many people under about 30 years or so probably won't even know what a carbon copy means anymore, but that's okay. What's important is that duplicate checks made record keeping a little easier, especially if we forgot to write a check into the register. So, if we maybe don't fondly remember those days of checkbooks, but remember that it was nice to be able to look at the register and quickly see a range of activity and balances, in QuickBooks, we need to know that we can still review bank accounts via registers. To display the register, we can do a couple of things. We can go back to the chart of accounts, which we have seen a few times, or we can use the home page, and we can move down to the bottom right-hand corner, and we can click or tap the Check Registers option. This is going to open a window, and it defaults to whatever the first bank account is that we have in our chart of accounts. In this case, we do not want our equipment at ABC bank account, so we'll display the drop down, and instead we will choose the checking account. We'll click or tap OK, and that displays the register, which we're going to go ahead and maximize so that we don't have a lot of other stuff showing up behind it. The first thing we should probably know is that this is the traditional or the typical way of looking at a register. It's known as a two-line register, where each transaction actually takes up 2 lines, and the shading does help us keep track of what we're looking at. However, at the bottom left of the screen, we do have a checkbox that gives us the option to simplify and compress the register by making it a one-line register. If we check the box, everything condenses down and is now shown on one line. If we remove the check mark, then it goes back to the traditional 2 lines. For our purposes, we're going to go ahead and keep it at the 2-line register. I think the register is fairly intuitive if we've ever used a check register before, but even if we haven't, it still is fairly straightforward to figure out. For any transaction, we have the date of the transaction number, and the account to which it's attributed to. Now let's talk a little bit about the transaction number. Generally speaking, this will be the number of a check that was written or a check that was printed. But these days, not everything has a check number. As we create our registers, we can actually enter any type of code here that we want, but we should be consistent. For example, if we ever use the ATM, then it's pretty intuitive to just say ATM is going to be our code. What about things that we do with a debit card? Some people type in debit, other people put DC, some people put EFT for electronic funds transfer. It can be anything we want. We just should be consistent and use the same types of abbreviations or designations throughout all of our registers. This field can also be left blank. It doesn't have to have something in it. The payee, of course, can be anybody that we have as part of our vendor or other lists, and this is the person or the business to whom we paid the money. If we're making deposits, it could be the person from whom we received the money. Part of the accounting process is always making sure that we attribute income or expenses to accounts. In the register, we can see that several of these entries say the word split. This simply means that the transaction was not posted to a single account, but 2 or more accounts. If we move down to the bottom of the screen, we can see some that were attributed to a single account. Here's a transfer of money from a savings account, and a transaction that we entered early on in the series was for office supplies. What I've said before, and I'll continue to say again and again, is I really think it's always important to document. We can see very quickly, without having to look at anything else about this transaction, that the one near the bottom of the screen was actually for QuickBooks training videos. Notice that none of the other transactions in this register have a memo. Personally, I think that's a mistake, and I think that any transaction we do should have a memo to help us understand what it is. When we review our register, or if someone else needs to know what a particular payment was for or deposit was for, it's easier to refer to the memo. Moving over to the right side of the screen, we have one column for payments and another column for deposits. In between is a thin column that on occasion will have a check mark. This check mark designates reconciled transactions, and we'll talk more about that in our topic on reconciliation. On the far right, as we'd expect, and as we would see in a paper-based register, we have a running total. Fortunately, QuickBooks does the math for us so that the running total is always available and always accurate. If we look carefully at the very bottom of the screen, we notice that the register always opens with the cursor in the next available transaction, so we can simply start typing and enter new transactions. If we want to edit a different transaction, we can move into the register itself and simply click and type. If we're having trouble locating a particular transaction from the top left side of the screen, we can click Go To and use any variety of criteria to search for specific transactions. If there's more than one, then we can use the back and next buttons to scroll through the register, either scrolling up or down through whatever transactions are found based on our criteria. If we're ever looking at the register, though, and notice a blue line, this is a visual indicator that tells us that everything that falls below the line is post-dated. In other words, this line will move based on the current date. In this case, we created a check that was dated in the future, and therefore, it differentiates it from things that have happened either today or in the past. If there's no blue line, we simply don't have any post-dated transactions, and that's just fine. Two last little features that make the register very easy to use is back up at the top of the screen, where we can choose to print a hard copy of the register for whatever purpose we may have, and we can also generate a quick report about a particular payee by selecting a transaction and then clicking or tapping the Quick Report button. So the check register seems to be fairly intuitive and easy to use and provides detail. One of the drawbacks to using forms, and in this case we're talking about the check form, is that we lose that overview and are immersed in each individual transaction. The register allows us to step back and get a broader view, as well as work very quickly with multiple transactions. Registers like this are available not only for bank accounts like checking and savings and money market, but even credit cards. Income and expense accounts do not have registers. It's important to remember, though, that we should not use registers instead of some of the QuickBooks features. For example, we need to use the Pay Bills option instead of just entering a check. Otherwise, we won't have any tie between a bill and the payment that we made for the bill. The same would be true for customers and invoice payments. Remember, though, that these activities will result in transactions that we can view from the register, but in order to properly credit, track, and link all of the parts of our business together, we should use the QuickBooks tools that allow us to do so more easily. Electronic transactions like a debit card or online payment are perfect times to use the register on its own, since they don't fit into any of the typical QuickBooks activities. Just know that the register is available for any of your bank accounts and offers an easy overview and easy method for working with transactions with this account.